He was Canada's youngest prime minister.
We had an election to win, and we won it.
Though he wasn't in 24 Sussex long, he's never really left Canadian public life. Now, his new book, How We Lead, talks about Canada's legacy on the world stage and what it could be in the future. He's got strong ideas on leadership, not just internationally, but also what it means to be a leader facing domestic challenges. That's where we begin the conversation this week with our guest, former Prime Minister Joe Clark. As Prime Minister, as opposition leader, as foreign minister, I mean, you were in the heart of governments at times, good times and at difficult times, yes. Times of crisis. We're watching a government now trying to handle or manage a crisis. Are they doing a good job?
Well, I think they started the crisis, and they started it really a long time ago. This is a government, I think, that came to office without much really, I'm going to say schooling, but I mean understanding, how our national institutions work. That's partly because they were literally outsiders, but also because there's a sense that they know better, and that has undermined approaches to accountability, even in terms of responding to Parliament, but also a disrespect for other quite important institutions of the parliamentary process.
But they've been in power 7 years.
I know that, and I think that if you're going to learn about these things, you have to learn early, and if you don't learn early, it's you get seduced by your success in going your own way and really suggesting to yourself and others that the institutions don't matter much. One of the things that's happened with them, and it's quite surprising to me to watch, is how much they have depended on attack. I mean, they came to office, there's always some attack back and forth in the House of Commons, but this is an entirely new situation. They came to office by attacking the Liberals. In office, they've attacked NGOs, environmental groups, organizations like Kairos and others who did things they disagree with. They took apart two Liberal leaders well before the campaign began. I'm not arguing the effectiveness or even the fairness of that. It's just an unusual method of going at things. Instead of consulting people, drawing them in, you in effect drive them away. What's really surprising now is that they are attacking their own. And it raises a very real question that comes back to the Prime Minister. If Mike Duffy has been such a problem, who appointed him? If Nigel Wright is the person they're blaming, who hired him? This is very tricky ground for the Prime Minister, and he, I think, is trapped by a process, by a use of a process that he himself created.
You seem to be suggesting, when you run through the list of names, Duffy, Wright, in terms of responsibility. At the end of the day, who's responsible for the situation we're seeing unfolding?
Yeah, we live in a system of responsible government. I mean, that question of...
But do we still live in a system of responsible government?
That's the point. Nominally it is, but in order to maintain that system, there has to be a real respect for accountability. And that's not just a matter of answering questions in the House. It's a matter of recognizing that the House is not some creation of your own or appendage of your party. The House is as important in our system as the government is.
But it seems to me, as somebody who's watched this over 4 decades, 5 decades almost, that something's changed on ministerial responsibility. And it didn't just happen with this government. There seems to have been a gradual period of change on that. When you were a backbench MP, you'd see ministers accept on the other side of the House, both in the 70s and 80s, yeah, responsibility and resign.
Yes.
We don't see that anymore.
You don't see that anymore, and I don't think you see the kind of internal debate within a cabinet that was certainly a characteristic of the 2 cabinets I served in, and also, I have to say, was a characteristic of cabinets I sat across from, particularly the first Trudeau cabinet. And in none of those cases was the Prime Minister a pushover. They were quite strong prime ministers, but they encouraged their close allies to speak up and to have an influence on policy. I don't think that happens anymore. And I think the involvement of the House has declined very, very sharply. In terms of you can't get public business referred to agencies of the House of Commons in a way that gives them the freedom to look at things. You and I are both old enough to remember the name Don Blencarn, who was the chairman of the Finance Committee, and who was an independent spirit, who was a very loyal member of my party, his party, but that loyalty did not mute him. On the contrary, he saw it as his responsibility, if he thought we were doing something wrong, to use the institutions of Parliament to let that be known. That no longer exists, and we accepted that. We didn't like it all the time, but we accepted it as part of the system. That's almost entirely gone.
But why is it gone?
It's gone because the government is a controlling government. Now, you're quite right. It goes back, it predates, and it goes back, I think the basic answer began back probably in the Pitfield era when power became so concentrated in the offices of the Prime Minister, whether that was the Privy Council office or the Prime Minister's office.
Pitfield was the clerk of the Privy Council
was the clerk of the Council under Trudeau. And no doubt there had been some of that before, but I think that has now become the style of government. And it's not only evident in my view, this is in effect an outsider to the public service. I was never a formal member of the public service. I think the things we're seeing on the political side, on the parliamentary side, are also being replicated on the public service side. I think there's much less independence, much less imagination, much less encouragement to question the center. And this is all happening at a time when, first of all, the range and the implications of business before public institutions, Parliament or public service, is so much more complex, and the need for people who would say, why are we doing this, is also more important. As our challenges increase, our capacity declines, and that's a really major issue. In fact, that's one of the issues I raise in my book, because I think that part of what has happened on international policy is that there is no way to present alternatives to the attitudes the government might espouse, and there's really no way to hold a government accountable on many of these issues.
All right, and I want to get to them. I don't want to dwell on this, but I just want to touch on one other part where you can help us in a way not many can, and that is to take us inside a government or a cabinet that is trying to deal with a crisis, to understand what actually should happen inside at that time. Now, as Prime Minister, even over 9 months, you faced a number of crises. As Foreign Minister, you witnessed how Prime Minister Mulroney handled things. What should happen when you're dealing with a situation like this? This has been going on for 9 months now, which was as long as you were Prime Minister. Yeah. What should be happening inside
to
deal with something like this?
First of all, you should recognize you're not going to be able to hide it. I think that's just rule number one. If there's something going on that is inappropriate, recognize that it is going to get out. And no matter what your skill or your self-confidence or your capacity to change the subject, it is going to get out. That's rule number one. Secondly, what I've found in crisis situations that I've been involved in, there was some very real frankness around the table. There were a couple of occasions I can think of, I won't identify them, when there wasn't as much frankness as there should have been. And we got into quite a bit of trouble because of that. And it's a simple old rule. Several minds are better than one alone, and particularly several minds that are inclined to look at things from different perspectives.
Do you think there's any kind of discussion like that going on in this cabinet or at the highest levels of this government on this issue?
I want to say two things. First, I know quite a few of the ministers of the government, not all of them, but some of them, and I have a great regard for some of them, an extraordinarily high regard in one or two cases. And I would hope that they would be making their point, but they are part of a system, and I think the system does not encourage that kind of discussion in the way that I hope I did as Prime Minister, that I know Mulroney did as Prime Minister, that I think Trudeau did as Prime Minister.
When we come back, how Canada should lead globally.
Would the world respond? You're damn right they would respond. There is a real need for some kind of leadership, particularly our kind of leadership,
More with former Prime Minister Joe Clark right after this.
On his first trip abroad, Nelson Mandela was welcomed as a head of state. Joe Clark, as head of the Commonwealth Anti-Apartheid Committee, was among the first to greet Mandela.
Warranting us to refer to Canada as another frontline country against apartheid.
Let's talk about your book,
Thank you.
How to Lead. And really, well, everything we've talked about so far
Yes,
is
it
about
is.
leadership. But this is very specific in terms of Canada's position on the global stage. At one point early in the book, you say that for the 6 decades after World War II, Canada's participation was about Canada, that it was led by the thought of Canada. Mm-hmm. And now you say it's become partisan. What do you mean by that difference?
What I think the way I put it is that we are very much a public interest country, and we have been for a long time. We, you know, if simply private calculations had been prominent around a table, we'd have never built a country, we'd have never built a railway, all of these kinds of things. And a sense of serving the public interest took different manifestations, but it was at the heart of most of the important things we've done. I think that this government is much more focused on very particular constituencies. It's election-based, 2 or 3 groups that it considers need to be defended or need to be advanced. It has a very narrowly economic view of the future of the country. It sees it in fairly narrow economic terms. And it regards a lot of the initiatives that other governments took to be beyond what governments should be doing. The Prime Minister at one point was highly critical. He claims it was a slip of the tongue, but he was highly critical of what he called Canada being a welfare state. Most Canadians, most governments, deliberately put those institutions in place because it was in the national interest. So there is a narrower view of the country, I think, at the heart of the government, and a narrower sense, more importantly, of the role of government. This is a very limited government, and the country, I think, is very, as I say, has a much broader view of what we should be doing. Now, what's this? Sorry, go ahead.
Well, what's the problem with that in terms of the country on the global stage?
The problem with it is that if you are not inclined to exercise sort of broad power and broad initiative domestically, you're not likely to do it internationally. You're likely to take a look at events around the world and say, where are our trading interests? Let us go there. Where is an immediate economic interest? Let us go there. But if there is an issue that does not have an immediate impact upon Canada, one draws away from that. If there are institutions which have a lot of palaver, take a long time to get to a resolution, you say the resolution is not really as necessary, and so let us draw away from that.
Do we not live in a world today that calls for that kind of direction?
No, I think we live in the opposite world. I think we live in a world in which much more discussion, much more engagement is needed. Let's look at some instant cases here. We have recently pulled back deliberately from Iran. Iran is a very complicated place. The rules of most games are not respected there, but nonetheless it is a very significant player, and it is extremely helpful to be on the ground to know what is going on there. Because that means that if something changes for better or for worse, we at least have some capacity, first of all, to know what it is, but more importantly, to play our own small role in responding to something. I've dealt with situations like that before. When Tiananmen Square was attacked, one of our options was to shut everything down, and we instead followed a very targeted series of responses to the government of China that made it clear we were not dealing with the government on a lot of cases, but we kept the lines open because we knew that if we simply walked away, we would stay away. And again, in the case of South Africa, which I think everyone agrees was a great success for Canadian international policy, if we had simply said, we're going to shut down the embassy because we disapprove of the apartheid regime, we would have had no influence at all. There would have been a big dramatic bang and then a long, long silence. So you have to be engaged. And if that was the case before, in a world where there were these great powers who were able to intervene, it's even more the case now, where decisions that are going to work are going to have to rely upon a number of nations and a number of organizations that are not nations coming together trying to solve problems. We have great credentials in the world that is developing, not just historic credentials. We have capacities in managing diversity, capacities in working with others that are more and more critical, and we should be pursuing them.
You make the point in the book that if your government, or the Trudeau government, before it or after it, had withdrawn from Iran, as the current government has done, there would have been no Ken Taylor as a hero, there would have been no
absolutely.
Argo movie, none of that would have happened.
Yeah.
But where do you draw the line? I mean, where would you say, you know, we're out of there? Or would you ever say that?
Oh, I suppose there are circumstances where one would say that. But, you know, I quote Winston Churchill, jaw is better than war. He was no pacifist. And I think if that was the case when he said it, it is even more the case now, not least because wars are so much more difficult to win or to resolve cases. And there needs to be a lot more conversation, a lot more knowledge. That's one of the reasons I'm very much interested in another point I make in the book, which has to do with the role of non-governmental organizations, non-state actors, because just in the nature of things, they have access to more of what is going on in the world we don't know than formal governments do. For one thing, formal governments now in a high security age are very constrained in what they can do, much more than they used to be. For other reasons, because there's budgetary constraint, we have fewer Canadians on the ground, even in some of these circumstances. So we need to rely upon these other sources. And as I tried to indicate in my book, there are many cases where they're much more imaginative. They have much more access than we do. I again ran into that as foreign minister when we were trying to begin the process of recognizing the right to self-determination of the Palestinians. The Palestinians would not see me. They were suspicious of a Canadian foreign minister, even then. And the only way we were able to find a way in is that one of our extremely able diplomats, Michel de Salaberry, was a good friend with the Mennonite Central Committee in the Palestinian territories, who were respected enough to convene a meeting. And the Palestinian leadership did not come so much to see me as they came for this first discussion to someone they trusted, and their trust was built. We couldn't have done that. And there are long lists of other instances where that was the case, but even more so, that's the reality. That's the reality now. And so what's interesting about Canada is that we have this very significant legacy of effectiveness in these kinds of multilateral settings. And we still have a high degree of innate respect among emerging societies and poor societies, places where trouble is likely to arise. Our bona fides are better than many other countries. So instead of drawing back gradually from those places, we should be looking for ways in which we, and sometimes, many times, we with others, can be effective in anticipating some of these problems or in resolving them if we anticipate late.
Last point on this. What do you say to some of those who may listen to what you're saying, read your book and say, he's living in the Pearsonian world and things have changed?
Well, thank you for this, because the real point of my book is that Canada came into its own after the Second World War because we recognized that things had changed then. The post-Second World War period is now coming to an end. It ended with the end of the Cold War. It ended with the Internet. We're dealing with a major new world in which the conflicts are conflicts between cultures, in which the challenge is to build partnerships. Those are things that, however relevant they might have been in Mr. Pearson's time, are much more relevant now. The irony is that Canada could do more now in this new world than we could then in that new world. And what we've got to do is take the lesson of what Canadians did in 1945, 46, 47. And it was Canadians really of every party and persuasion, and apply those now. Would the world respond? You're damn right they would respond. There is a real need for some kind of leadership, particularly our kind of leadership. One of the points I make is that we do not insist always at sitting at the head of the table. In our view, historically, what happens at the table is more important than who's at the head of it. And we have been able over time, and we certainly could be in this emerging world, to make sure that those tables were very effective.
Still to come, advice from a former prime minister to the current one.
He has to bring people into the facts. That's a careful way of saying what...
It's a careful way of saying he's not telling us the real story. Final thoughts with the Right Honourable Joe Clark right after this.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister, and it is framed in the knowledge that on this day when television is first reflecting the debates of the House of Commons...
As unlikely as it may seem, if Stephen Harper picked up the phone and called you and said, "I need your advice," what would be the single piece of advice you'd give him on what was happening right now?
Right now, I think he has to bring people into the facts. That's a careful way of saying what, and I think that it's
a careful way of saying he's not telling us the real story.
And I think he needs to tell the real story, and I think he needs to seek some advice as to what's the most effective way to do that. That's a question he should have asked a long time ago. And that's part of the dynamic of what we're facing now.
On that, I thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Good luck with the book.
Thank you.